For those of you tuning in, we're just going to wait a couple of minutes and allow people to join before we get things underway. But appreciate you jumping on.
I'm going to take this opportunity to get some water.
Perfect.
It's dry out here in the West.
Yeah.
We've had a unique situation. It started raining about 9 o'clock, drizzle, and we're having another cell go overhead now. So that's highly unusual for Eastern Colorado to have overnight moisture without that wing effect on mountain storms coming over the peaks.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
it seems
we're
like
blessed to have it. No question about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like we've had a couple of showers over in Eastern Colorado as well. And then I was driving, Denver got a shower as well. So hopefully these little cells come in and drop some water where it's needed. So it looks like people are continuing to pile in. We're going to give it maybe another 30 more seconds and we'll get underway.
I got a quick water story while everybody's getting in.
Yeah, go for it, Rick.
There's this really eccentric lady that I was raised with that was raised in Northern Nevada. She was actually born in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Wow. And her family ended up in Nevada on a ranch, not very far from Winnemucca. And she was out with one of the hands one day and she's like, it's so dry here. It's so dry. And he was like, yeah, it's pretty dry. And she goes, my nose isn't even running. That's how dry it is. And he goes, yeah, it's so dry out here in Winnemucca. You don't blow your nose, you just pick it.
Yeah, hopefully that's great. Hopefully no one Winnemucca takes offense to that. But yeah, the high West is a very interesting environment when it comes to some of those ranches.
I found it's hard to.
True in New Mexico.
Yeah, so. Absolutely.
It's hard to offend people.
No offense taken.
Yeah. Well, before Rich just completely steals the show, I think we can get things underway. First and foremost, welcome to the Future of Carbon webinar, sponsored by AgriWebb. Today, we're going to be discussing really what is the process of preparing for the carbon markets. Is there a profit to be had? And really kind of go into potential action items when it comes to how can we as ranchers really move the ball forward, and if this is something we would like to pursue on our own ranch. My name is Kobe Buck. I grew up on a ranch in Eastern Colorado, and I'm the U.S. account manager for AgriWebb. We've been here for about 18 months and officially launched at the beginning of this year, and have been working with producers on a daily basis since then. But the purpose of this conversation is to really kind of extend some insights and extend the conversation away from just the AgriWebb product or ranch management product, and really engage in these every 6 weeks we have a webinar to talk about issues that come up in the cattle and ranching industry. So we've been fortunate enough to really get an all-star lineup when it comes to talking about the conservation and carbon conversation. And I will quickly just do a couple of housekeeping notes. First and foremost, this is a great group of panelists that, have dedicated a lot of their time, a lot of their resources, a lot of their bandwidth to addressing the carbon situation and working with producers in native grasslands to see where we can move the ball forward on our end. So I hope that everyone that attends really kind of jumps in and has a very productive conversation that's very much in goodwill and really get some strong value out of that. But next, I think I'll just briefly introduce the moderator. You won't hear from me very much today. We're going to leave it to the specialist when it comes to the situation. And we've been fortunate enough to have Steve Wooten be our moderator today. So Steve grew up on a multi-generational cattle ranch in southeast Colorado. So he's gone through drought, he's gone through some productive years, and has been able to have a ranch that's been sustainable throughout those generations. In addition to just working on the ranch day to day, Steve has also dedicated a lot of his time to being a real advocate for the industry in the state, an advocate in the region, and an advocate across the United States. He is recently elected for a second term, I believe, Steve, as the president of the Colorado Cattlemen's Association. And he's additionally the chairman for the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So, Steve, I might botch that introduction, but I'll give it to you and let you introduce the panelists so we can get things underway.
Thank you, Colby. And no, you didn't botch it. You got it just right. It's a talk about this. One of the things that why I think this is important is we've seen somewhat of a race between which issue is most pressing within our agriculture industry and the beef sector in my part of it, and that's been a sustainability or carbon. And within that realm of sustainability is carbon, because of the environment, the resource, and the conversations that are being held from consumer all the way back to us producers. And I think setting up a panel of these distinguished individuals with their knowledge in carbon and sharing that out so that other producers and other individuals that are interested in this conversation can gain some knowledge, gain some background and some resources to where they can go and find if it's a product or a system that they can apply to their ranch, or understand what ranching and what agriculture productions do to meet the demand by society to be more environmentally sustainable, and wrestle with of greenhouse gas and water and other factors. We've got a great story to tell in agriculture, and I think you guys at AgriWebb this up. It gives us a chance to share with other producers, but I'm sure we've got interested in carbon that aren't necessarily putting work on the. I applaud you all for working on that. I'd like to and move and let our panelists do some introductions of themselves. And first, I'd like to introduce Nicole Buckley-Biggs. And Nicole, I'll hand.
Thanks, Steve. I wish I could see everyone on my screen, but I can't. But hello, if I know you, good to see you. I hope to meet everyone here at some point. I'm a grad student at Stanford. I'm in the 4th year of my PhD. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, which is a lot more humid than the West, but I've been living in California in recent years. I have about 10 years of work experience on different types of policy and in corporations. But now my research is focused on the variety of services that ranchers and farmers provide to society, and often uncompensated. And I look at how landowners can be compensated for those things in ways that really make sense for farmers and ranchers. So I look at things like solar energy, carbon farming, and other land use types. But I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts with everyone today and learning from the rest of the panel and from the questions that come up.
Thank you, Nicole. And next, I'd like to introduce Ava Stricker with the Quivira Coalition.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Eva Stricker. I'm the director of the Carbon Ranch Initiative with Quivira. We're a small nonprofit in Santa Fe, New Mexico, focusing on regenerative agriculture. I'm also a researcher at the University of New Mexico, so I wear different hats on different days. Today is one of my Quivira hats. And looking forward to hearing from everyone and learning from you all also. I think these are a great opportunity to hear from the people who are attending just as much as to hear from us. So find the community, even if it's online, to help you reach your goals would be my tip for attending this session. Thanks.
Thank you, Ava. And next is Zach Pinto with Keiko ISOM.
Thanks, Steve. So my name is Zach Pinto. I work for a firm called Keiko ISOM, which is a food and agriculture business advisory and accounting firm that works primarily in the United States, but is also expanding internationally. I have the privilege and honor of working every day with folks across the food and agriculture supply chain. So our beef producers at the ranching level, all the way up through the packer processor. It's really exciting to be here today, and I'm looking forward to digging in on this carbon issue with everybody.
Thank you, Zach. And our fourth panelist is Rich Bradbury, founder of Karn Grass-Fed Cattle. Welcome, Rich.
Thank you, Steve. We're part of a grass-fed co-op called I got my co-op screwed up. Desert Mountain Grass-Fed Beef. And with Desert Mountain Grass-Fed Beef, we've been focusing on the relationship between the farmer, the rancher, and getting a finished product to market using regenerative agriculture. And carbon has been a big topic between the two as we balance that going down the road. My family was early into a large beef co-op called Country Natural Beef. And so I have a sort of a skewed perspective on this since I've been talking to customers for 30 years and really wanted to tune in and listen. We listened to them when they told us that they wanted grass-fed, and we're listening now that talking about they want to know more about the soil health, the carbon sequestration, all that kind of stuff. I'm in southeastern Oregon. It's a very arid environment, about 7 inches of rain to 12 inches of rain a year. But there's a lot of things we can do out here. Rangelands, they sequester a tremendous amount of carbon. Wetlands we have, they also do. I think ranchers have a legacy of what customers are looking for, and we just need to communicate that better.
Thank you, Rich. I'll go through a little bit of how this will work today. You will notice it be muted throughout the presentation, but we encourage you to go ahead and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the bar there and engage with others through those questions. We will have about an hour of panelist presentations, and then we'll move into answering those questions that were produced by the audience. And we aim to answer all or as many of those questions as we can, 30-minute question and answer session. But please feel free to contribute throughout as something comes to your mind during one of the presentations. Go ahead and put it in that Q&A. Forget as you hear more information than that. So at the end, we will put all panelists' contact information and to get in touch and continue these conversations with and find out more information and leverage and find out how you can leverage carbon markets and engage with them. So with those housekeepings in order, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole and she'll presentation. So she'll start her screen share.
Thanks, Steve. Can you see that all right?
Yep, we got you, Nick.
All right. Well, hello again, everyone. Kobe asked me to tee things up with a broad intro on carbon markets and rangeland. So I'm going to give a bit of background, a little bit of context. I know people come to this at different levels, so I'm going to try to make it user-friendly. I may raise more questions than I'm answering, but that's part of the discussion, and I look forward to hearing what other panelists think about some of these topics. I also want to say that I hope that this whole webinar is useful for people regardless of their perspectives on climate change. So whether you think that climate change is human caused, or if you think the climate changes, I think this is relevant to everyone. And that's because, especially for farmers and ranchers, there's some really interesting economic opportunities coming up, also opportunities to support ranchers' broader goals that might be not directly relevant to climate change. So I think this is an important thing for all ag producers to track. And I hope to be able to provide some useful information to everyone today, or at least things to think about. So I will start with where I start thinking about carbon markets, and it's actually a step back from carbon markets. It's a category that carbon markets sit within, and that's called payments for ecosystem services. Now, payments for ecosystem services begs the question, what's an ecosystem service? You can think of it as a benefit that nature provides to support humans or society. And these can include a whole lot of different things. This is kind of the pinwheel of services that I think of having to do with ranches and rangelands in particular. So they're used for food production, managing water quality and also quantity, so regulating the flow of waters, soil health, managing for mitigating wildfire risk through fuels reduction and vegetation management. Then there are a suite of services that support wildlife and biodiversity, whether it's for the sake of biodiversity itself or for things like hunting as game habitat. And then of course there's culture and leisure that has to do with values like the view shed. That's a service that nature is providing by having these landscapes. And then of course, more and more relevant today, we have the opportunity to produce renewable energy on rangeland. So that's yet another service. And there's more far beyond what I have here, but this gives you a sense of what counts as an ecosystem service. And these are, any landowner knows this is things they think about all the time and that they're balancing in their decision-making process. Some of these things landowners are not paid for and some they are. When they are paid for them, they are considered payments for ecosystem services. So I want to break that down for you, these payments in particular. And you won't see this broken down in other places like this, but I think it's a very kind of organized way to think about PES, is what it's called for short. So there's three basic types of payments for ecosystem services, as far as I see it. One is price premiums. And a lot of people are familiar with these. It's everything from USDA organic, kind of your certified, formally certified products, to the more premium products that are not formally certified, but maybe you're getting a premium at the farmer's market, say for a product that's more sustainably raised. A second form of payment for ecosystem services is the formal PES markets that we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about this a bit later, but they come in both regulated or compliance form and also voluntary form. A lot of things fit into this category. California's cap and trade, offsets trading, carbon trading. Some of them are required, some aren't. So we'll talk about that. And then the final form of payments for ecosystem services are government programs that also a lot of people here will be familiar with. That's everything from the Williamson Act, tax subsidies for ag production, to extension service programs that provide technical assistance for more sustainable land management, NRCS programs. Those all fit within this. And the reason I break it down into these different categories so that you can kind of compare them against each other is because there's a different entity or person that pays in each of these cases for the premium or the extra income that you're getting as the landowner, as the producer. For price premiums, it's a consumer who values a more sustainable product and they're willing to pay more for it. For PES markets, it can be either consumers or in a lot of cases, corporations. So for consumers, if you fly somewhere and want to offset your emissions, you can buy a carbon offset. That's your private consumer choice. Corporations, on the other hand, are buying offsets for a variety of other goals that we'll talk about. And then finally, on the government side, you have obviously public agencies that are providing that additional income to landowners, or in some cases, nonprofit NGO partners that can be land trusts, for instance, that are doing conservation easements with landowners or other programs. So with all that in mind, we'll focus today on the carbon markets, both voluntary and regulated compliance markets. But this is the broader menu of PES that they sit within. So this all begs the question, are these PES markets real today? And the answer is yes. They're worth about $36 billion globally. That includes not just carbon markets, but water quality, water quantity markets, biodiversity credits. It's a whole lot of different ecosystem services that are being traded in various ways for various reasons, but it is a real market. The idea behind the carbon markets in particular is mitigating climate change. As a society trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that are derived from human activities in order to reduce the greenhouse gas effect and climate change, that's the philosophy. The motivation, however, behind carbon markets has to do with, for the most part, with corporate commitments to being more sustainable and taking climate action. And it's the need for these companies to hit their publicly stated corporate goals that's driving most of the activity right now in this market. So going back to the idea of compliance versus voluntary markets, these are two different markets and it's important to distinguish them. Compliance markets are driven by regulation, by government regulation, where companies are forced to reduce their emissions because of the government commitment. A voluntary market is a company or an individual wanting to reduce their emissions for voluntary reasons. In the US, we don't have national level regulation of greenhouse gases. We don't have a US commitment yet or a carbon market yet at the national level. So any compliance markets within the US are at the state level. And I know that we have international folks on the line here, and it varies from country to country within the Paris Agreement, which countries have committed to reducing their emissions. But within the US, for instance, California has its own cap and trade program. The cap and trade program basically includes some of the largest greenhouse gas emitters. These are power plants, refineries, manufacturers, and they have a decreasing cap on how much they can emit year over year, with the end goal of kind of slowly ramping down their greenhouse gas emissions. In that program, they don't consider actually agriculture carbon sequestration projects or carbon farming projects as a form of offset. And the reason for that is because there's a 100-year requirement in that program that the carbon actually stay in the soil, that we can depend on that carbon staying in the soil. And that's really hard to do on agriculture landscapes. So far, that hasn't been integrated into that program. But most of the activity you'll see, and I think where everyone on this line should probably be focused, is the voluntary markets. There's been a significant increase in interest, largely driven by corporations making very ambitious commitments around greenhouse gas reductions. And you'll see between 2016 and 2018, there was a over 50% increase in that voluntary carbon offset market. So that's a snapshot of where we are today. Another big change that's happened recently is in the past, most of the approaches to carbon trading were rules-based, basically asking landowners to change their practices in a specific way. And there was an assumption of how much carbon would be sequestered based on that practice, and they would be compensated according to which practice they adopted. The problem with that is how much carbon is sequestered really varies from place to place. It depends on soil type, it depends on climate, the previous historical stewardship of the landscape. And so in order to keep this system rigorous, the community of people working on carbon markets realized that we needed to make them outcomes-based. It's more important how much additional carbon is actually sequestered in the soil year over year in a measurable way. And that's what we're looking to for mitigating climate change. So in the past, we had actually a national level carbon market that closed in 2010. That was the Chicago Climate Exchange. That was a rules-based market. It had a lot of problems with it, including dissatisfaction of landowners participating in that market. Many things have been kind of updated and improved on since that time based on issues that came up then. And one of those things is we need to really depend on outcomes, real outcomes at the ground level for all the current markets. It's like my slides aren't going forward. Oh, here we go. Okay. Vocabulary is a little bit tedious, but just because a lot of these terms can be confusing, at least for me, I wanted to run through some terminology really quickly. The first is carbon credit versus carbon offset. Are they the same? A carbon credit, I think you can think of it as a permit. It's a permit that allows a company to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. And it's basically the right to emit a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, or MTCO2e, that's the abbreviation you'll see. So that's usually under a regulated program, like a cap and trade program. In contrast, a carbon offset is unregulated. So it's in a system where people are voluntarily, or companies are voluntarily offsetting their emissions. And the offset is a payment for reduction in the CO2 emissions of 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So that part's the same, the amount, but it's as a result of a specific project. These projects are usually outside of a company's direct operations. So it includes things like, you've probably heard, installing methane digesters on dairy operations. Those are outside of the operations of the companies who end up buying these offsets. Now, carbon offsets actually can come from 2 different sources. One is, you can see this down arrow, is carbon removal. So removing carbon from CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it long enough in the soil so that it's considered permanent. That type of offset is usually cheaper because companies don't actually have to reduce their emissions, so they're easier to implement. The other type of offset is avoided carbon emissions. So you see the up arrow, that's emissions. We're trying to reduce how much we're emitting. So preventing the greenhouse gas emissions that would have otherwise taken place in your operation if not for the activity that you implemented. I hope this makes sense, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A. So then if you're a landowner and you want to sell your carbon offsets, what do you do? Who do you sell to? There's two approaches. One is a direct sale. This means you contract with someone who will buy an offset from your property based on whatever activity you've decided you will implement. So a landowner, for instance, can contract with an energy company. In other cases, you have a formal market that's trading carbon offsets. And those markets can be either government markets or private markets. I mentioned the Chicago Climate Exchange, that's not around anymore. Biden and Senate, the legislature have been looking at creating a USDA carbon bank or carbon market. There's the Growing Climate Solutions Act that's just gone to the House after the Senate approved it, that may be getting the government involved in this space. But most of the government markets are at the state level. There's about 13 states that have markets today, as far as I've been tracking. And 10 of those are in the Northeastern Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We also have it obviously in California and in Washington. Then on the private side, this is a really interesting space to track right now. There's a couple of startups, Indigo Ag and Nori. Nori is a software-based company that's basically making it easy for companies that need to offset their emissions to purchase offsets from landowners, farmers or ranchers that are implementing these projects on the ground. Indigo Ag is similar. They're both offering about $15 a ton for soil carbon. There's corporate-led initiatives like Bayer's Carbon Initiative, but the one that I really want everyone to be watching is the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, ESMC. And the reason that I'm pointing this one out is because when it first started, there were about 50 companies involved. Now there are many more. It's a group of multinational big food and ag companies, NGOs, so conservation groups, academics, others who are working together to develop a new kind of first ever carbon market that will be privately led. And they're piloting it right now in the Great Plains, across croplands, across rangelands, and as last I heard, they were planning to launch next year. So it's about to come online with both carbon trading and also water quality and water quantity trading. So this is the field right now. There are many others. I ran out of room on the slide to list them all. And I'm sure there'll be more popping up every month as people are more and more interested in this space. There's a host of practices or management activities that landowners can use to increase soil carbon and then trade those corollary offsets on the market. The biggest ones today that are used are methane digesters on dairy operations, grazing management, and that can either be rotational type grazing, which is a very broad category, or stocking rate reductions is another one that comes up. Changing or reducing tillage, using cover cropping, reducing fertilizer use, and then some of them have converting marginal cropland to grasslands. Oops, sorry. Anyway, we can jump into this example here. I wanted to do kind of a back of the envelope. What does it really look like if I participate in a carbon market? So I pulled Indigo Ag, one of these startups, and I broke down the process into 3 steps. So here's step 1. Step 1 is about contracts, about setting up the market. For Indigo Ag, first they need to sign contracts with corporations that will buy the offsets, and those contracts have been at $20 a ton. So let's say Boston Consulting Group, Dogfish Head Craft Brewery, they want to purchase these offsets. Those are actual clients of Indigo Ag's. At the same time, Indigo Ag signs contracts with farmers and ranchers who will be paid $15 a ton for their sequestered carbon in a 10-year period. You can see there's a $5 a ton margin, right, between those two. Step 2 is the landowner needs to change their management in some way to increase soil carbon. And that change in carbon needs to be verified. So Indigo Ag uses this third-party company, Verified Carbon Standard. They pay for the costs of verification. And then finally, the outcome of interest for landowners and also for the corporations who need to buy these offsets is once the additional carbon has been measured, and documented with evidence, then a payment comes out of it. So let's just make an assumption. Let's say you were able to successfully sequester 2 tons per acre of carbon in your soils. At $15 a ton, that would be about $30 an acre. Hopefully I did this math right. If someone wants to correct me later, that would be great. If you've implemented this activity on 500 acres, that's about $15,000 that you've earned in that 10-year period for your involvement in this market. that's what it looks like from my angle. And, I welcome other people's perspectives on this. Now, if you're as a landowner trying to evaluate the carbon market opportunity, you might want to look at the pros and the cons. There's always both, and people often don't present both to you. So here's my take at that. Here are the potential benefits that you can see. One is everyone is looking for income diversification, especially if you're in a volatile commodity market or you're seeing big inter-annual and annual swings in your income, right? It's another way to draw income into your operation. You may be uncomfortable working with in government programs, or you may want to increase the income that you're getting, say, from a cost sharing program with NRCS. So this maybe could meet that need. It could provide a source of financing similarly. So one of the ESMC market members is Danone North America. They make Danone yogurt for those who eat yogurt. They've marketed a $20 million program supporting farmers that are transitioning to regenerative and organic practices. So a lot of the players in this market are providing financing upfront to help landowners adopt new practices. Outside of finances, participating in these activities might help to actually improve some of the ecosystem services on your property, things like soil health, clean water, biodiversity. And then by improving soil health and fertility, you could also improve the resilience of your operation to extreme weather events, to long-term impacts of climate change, et cetera. One thing I've heard a lot in interviews with ranchers, especially younger ranchers, but across the board, is that folks are interested in data. They want to know, if I change my practice, what is the actual change on the ground? Instead of just looking and trying to see with your eyes how much more healthy the system is, getting the real data points. And in a lot of these cases, the companies, the data platforms are tracking all of that and can make the data accessible to you so that you can make data-based decisions. Okay, all of that is balanced with the risks and the downsides of the carbon markets. One of them is verification costs. And this is something you can find out upfront. So in each case, who does the verification and who pays for it varies widely. Indigo Ag covers it, Nori doesn't. So out of that $15 per ton, you have to start calculating how much is the verification going to cost you. ESMC has a phone app that they've developed to identify where the soil sampling site should be. Otherwise, you might be paying an expert $2,000 or more for a soil sampling plan. And these things add up. So that's a big downside, is the cost of monitoring. Another big one is actually being able to increase your soil carbon on your property. You may change your management practices, do everything they recommend, and for a variety of reasons, you might just not see that additional soil carbon. Similarly, carbon markets put the risk, the transition risk upfront on producers. So they are the ones that have to learn about the practices, spend their precious time adopting new systems and implementing them and financing them with the hope that down the road they will see the outcomes they want. That's a lot of upfront risk to put on producers. That begs the question, is it worth it? This is one thing that came up with the Chicago Climate Exchange. Is the amount that you will be paid down the road enough to offset the costs of enrolling and implementing these activities? So for instance, is your cover cropping seed going to be more than the income that you might get if that's the activity that you're implementing? And you may successfully implement your program, your new management, sequester additional carbon, prove it through verification. But at the end of the day, a company needs to come along and want to buy that carbon offset at that price and be interested in it. And that's actually a question that a lot of corporations brought up to me when I interviewed them, is they would like to see these things happen, but they don't know if there will actually be that much demand for carbon offsets. It needs to materialize. The last one here is something people often don't think about, but I want to point out that increasing soil carbon might not be your goal, and it might not be your priority goal over all other things that you're doing on your property. Studies have found that there can be downsides to increasing soil carbon. So if you apply compost on rangelands, for instance, increasing soil fertility could result in less plant diversity of native plants. It can also increase soil lead and nitrate and phosphorus runoff. And so I think we need to very carefully evaluate these different risks and opportunities, where increasing soil carbon makes sense for you as a landowner and where it might not. And just quickly, I have a literature review on this for anyone who's interested. But there's been a lot of studies trying to capture how much soil carbon could be increased on rangelands using different types of grazing systems. It's been very hard to reliably increase soil carbon using grazing management. And that's because on semi-arid and arid rangelands, precipitation and soil type just have a much stronger influence on soil carbon and soil carbon changes over time than anything a human manager might do. And that's, you can see in the literature review that there's been a lot of studies in different places, not enough in California. We need a lot more research there, but you probably want to see the data before you jump into this. Another thing influencing these outcomes is what plant communities you have at the site where you're implementing these activities. So grasses with a C4 photosynthetic pathway might see a very different result in additional carbon than those that don't. Historical stewardship of a property also influences how much additional carbon you can sequester. And it may be in many places that the landscape has reached what's called the maximum carbon stabilization capacity, where the soil carbon is already saturated. And you might do things to try to increase soil carbon, but it's just not possible in that location. On the rigor of the markets side of things, permanence of carbon is still being studied. The science is very much in progress right now. And that has to do with permanence of carbon once it's sequestered, both in the top range of the soil and at deeper levels, so that the cycling of carbon at different depths of soil is very much an active discussion right now and not a settled area of research by any means. For producers, transitioning or adopting new practices can be hard, it can be slow, so it's a time commitment, and that makes these markets challenging. And I already talked about the monitoring costs. There's bureaucratic hurdles. You have to learn a new program and do paperwork and spend time that's not with your family or other things you might be wanting to do. So there's some serious trade-offs here. This is kind of the last one is a moral question. I think a philosophical question everyone needs to ask themselves is, do they want to be part of a carbon market, and does that matter to them? A lot of people will argue that when you are doing something good on your own property and selling a carbon offset to a company for it, you're basically allowing that company to emit greenhouse gases while buying somebody else's offset. And so that can be seen as a form of greenwashing. It's a very personal choice. If you want to participate in that, you might not agree with that framing, but it's something to think about. And on this greenwashing, there was a really interesting recent study. It was by Carbon Plan, a nonprofit recently created. They wanted to see how accurate, how rigorous are carbon offset markets. So they looked in California at the cap and trade market, specifically the forest carbon offsets program. And they pulled all the publicly available project records. What they found was that a third of the carbon offsets that they analyzed were over-credited. They weren't really sequestering the carbon that they were claiming to, so they weren't doing anything for the benefit of climate change mitigation. And that was about 30 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Or put another way, 20 to 39 million credits were created without providing climate benefits. The real problem here, and I love that they call them ghost credits, is that they allow regulated companies to emit more greenhouse gases. So they don't have to actually reduce their gases, and they can use these types of credits to get away with the emissions. Every market is different. This was in the forest carbon offset market, not rangelands, but I think it's something to keep an eye on in any market that you're participating in. As a landowner, I want to suggest what landowners might think about if they're considering participating in carbon markets, and maybe other panelists can speak to these questions as well. First thing is, what management practices does the company pay for? Does that align with your plans for your property? How much will you be paid? What is the portion that you will get versus the company running or the nonprofit running the market? How much will it cost to verify and sell your offsets or your credits? Who owns your data? This is important. What can the aggregator do with the data? Will it be shared with anybody? What currency is the payment in? I just received an email the other day from Nori saying that they're doing a cryptocurrency. So it's not all just a cash or a check that comes to, and you have to be very careful to make sure you fully understand what type of program you're participating in. How long will it take to make the money? Do you get some of the money up front? Is it spread out over time? Do you get it at a specific date in the future based on the soil carbon that year? Can your carbon credits be stored? And if so, for how long? So this is relevant, say, for cryptocurrency. Can you hold on to that credit until as the market price goes up for it and then trade in it? And this all really depends. It's a very case-by-case basis. Can I be paid for carbon sequestering practices that I previously adopted prior to joining the market? Some of them allow for that today. Is there a penalty fee if the land changes ownership or is rented? In some cases, there is a penalty. In other cases, it isn't, may or may not be significant. It's worth asking. And will I need to invest in new technologies or platforms to participate? So I want to stop here, and I think Liz or Kobe or someone at AgriWebb is going to do a quick poll for us, of our audience, so I can take a break from talking. And question is, what is your top goal for your ranch? Should I stop sharing my screen, Kobe?
I think we can launch out on top of it, Nick. So
Okay.
Yep, everyone should see it. And anyone tuning in, just start clicking on your top goals. So feel free to chime in and tell us what you think. Let's see. Yep, looks like people are jumping in pretty quickly. So we'll give it maybe a minute and then be able to look at the results. Okay, maybe another 15 or 20 seconds. So if anyone's having problem finding the poll, it should pop up on your screen directly, and just click the option that you most relate with. And we'll close it right out the minute mark. So looks like votes are still coming in. Apologies if I cut your answer short, but just for the sake of time, we want to be sure to get to the Q&As. So if I end the poll, we can start to see if everyone can see that. Okay, we can see roughly 52% of the attendees said that stewardship of the land is the most important goal for their operation. But it's pretty evenly dispersed across all facets. Mitigating climate change and supporting biodiversity both have 11%. The long-term preservation is 28%. Profit and preserving my family legacy is 30. Both of those are 31%. So fairly even distribution, but really stewardship takes the lion's share.
Great. Okay, so this leads me to my next point, and then probably make this my final point because I know I'm over time. Corporations and ranchers may have very different goals. And I was guessing that you were going to respond stewardship because I've interviewed a lot of ranchers and farmers, especially ranchers, in my research. And for the most part, people talk about the importance of the long term of protecting soil health, of making the landscape healthy over time so their families can inherit it and continue to take care of the land. Although that's not corporations' goals, there is an area of overlap that I think you can focus on in participating in these markets. And that's what I'm showing here. So if ranchers are interested in preservation and stewardship and conservation of the landscape, and corporations or these new carbon markets are incentivized by their corporate commitments, their sustainability commitments, and they're also trying to influence producers to change their behaviors. That's why it says behavior change on the left. But really at the center of it is both parties are interested in doing things to support soil health. Now I should point out, soil health is not the same as soil carbon. Soil carbon is one variable. To measure soil health, you can look at things like water infiltration, biodiversity, pH. There's a long list of them. Often corporations conflate soil health and soil carbon. They're not the same thing, but to the extent that the things that you're doing as part of a carbon market are helping to support your soil carbon and your soil health, that may be enough incentive for you to participate. And you may be getting out of this market what you want, the data, the financing, the format and platform to achieve your own goals. And the last thing I'll note is that when people talk about rangelands and cattle operations, they often talk about rotational grazing or managed grazing as the best carbon opportunity. In our research, we found that in California, although a third of California is grazed by livestock, there's a very high pressure of conversion to high intensity agriculture like vineyards and orchards, and also to residential and commercial development. And in that context, one of the most promising things we can do from a pure soil carbon perspective in California is preventing conversion of rangelands. So if you take a look at our literature review, you'll see a lot of evidence supporting that. There's also other things you can do. I mentioned here, the American Carbon Registry recognizes this important carbon aspect of the landscape. And so they're actually considering conservation easements a signal of avoiding conversion of grasslands and shrublands to crop production. And that's part of the carbon market framework. But it's really an important thing to think about in any rangeland landscape where there's pressure for conversion. And there's also a host of things besides grazing one can do that are more promising from a soil carbon perspective than managed grazing. That's restoring marginal cropland back to rangelands, riparian restoration, organic amendments in some cases, where it makes sense, and then silvopasture. And I'll stop there. I know I threw a whole lot at everyone. I'm looking forward to your questions and to hearing what the other panelists have to say.
Thank you, Nicole. That was informative, great presentation, and I already see it's questions, and I want to remind everybody to use the question and answer and engage with us. And we're going to move next to a presentation by Ava. So Ava, I will you to share your screen.
Great. Thank you so much. And Nick, thank you so much. That was great. I don't know how I missed that paper this year, so I'll go back and read it. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm with the Quivira Coalition, and because we're a small nonprofit, I cannot do a presentation without talking about how cool we are broadly, and then I'll get to my point. But we work to build resilience in arid working lands. If you're a rancher or farmer and you want to pass on the knowledge that you have to another generation, we have an amazing apprenticeship program with 8-month apprenticeships. We have an education program with lots of in-field, really practical workshops, as well as now, of course, transitioning to remote content. And then we have our wonderful Regenerate conference, which if you've never attended, we now have 2 options. You can do a virtual or an in-person. And then, see, I told you I'd get to my point. I'm with the Carbon Ranch Initiative, and our vision is to build soil carbon on working lands. And I quickly want to acknowledge, since we're a very place-based organization, that I live and work on lands that are ancestral and present-day lands of Apache, Diné, and Pueblo tribes and peoples. There's long-standing inequities and exacerbated by COVID. And so some things that we're working on is building a tribal stewardship program to help tribes reach their stewardship goals with us supporting them. So I mentioned that we were working to build soil carbon on working lands, but I loved how Nick set me up. We really want to think a little bit more broadly in what we do and think about soil health. We operate in sort of 3 different directions, and hopefully I'll show you how those tie together. We are engaging in research, so things like the compost trials that Nick prefaced. We also do lots of outreach, so taking that research and making it usable for producers, giving them tools and skills to make changes on their operation. And then we also acknowledge that even with the best information, it's still really hard to make a change. And so we're starting to build up our technical service wing, where we do one-on-one planning services with people. So I think this is how it works of making a change. You have to know if it's going to work. You have to get educated on what you need to do to make a change. And then you still need to reach out and make a change. It doesn't have to be with a formal technical service provider. As I mentioned, having a network, either local or the people who are also interested in it. So I'll just say again, look through the participant list if you're able, and reach out to each other, because it's such a good way of making a change, is not going through it alone. Because this is hard. What we're doing is really challenging. But I don't have to tell any of you that. So thank you again, Nick, for the really broad introduction. I was tasked with a couple of other common questions that came up when you all registered. So I wanted to answer these. So hopefully this is not too foreign, but where is the soil carbon? Where does it come from? We've sort of probably seen these diagrams in a high school chemistry book, but I think what's lost from these diagrams is like, if you inhale and then take a deep exhale, what is happening? What's happening is that we're taking something that's physical and hard and, you know, ultimately was derived from photosynthesis. We're turning something that's hard and durable back into the air, right? That's what's happening when we breathe out. And then plants are on the other side of it. They're taking something that's invisible in the air and they're turning it into, well, my houseplants are a little bit sad today, but they're turning it into real hard stuff. And so I think that gets lost in the talk about, you know, photosynthesis and respiration, everything. It's pretty amazing. It takes something invisible and puts it into a solid form. So that's what's happening with the plants. And then of course, there's all sorts of other things happening. We've got microbes that are respiring. We've got things like earthworms, even the roots respire. Of course, we know that the roots need air to be successful. And these are lots of different forms of carbon, right? So we know intuitively that we can't chew on a branch from a tree, but we can eat an apple. So those are all carbon-based and there's different forms. So those different forms get into the soil and sometimes some of them turn over and are respired back into the atmosphere quickly, and others become more in a stabilized form. And so that's how we get soil carbon. It's predominantly all coming from the photosynthetic organisms. I'll also do a quick shout out to biocrusts, which are also photosynthetic, but they're a smaller organism and smaller proportion of the photosynthesis that's happening on drylands. So if we, you know, this is a snapshot from Wikipedia of soil profiles, and in some parts of the country, if you dig a hole, it really does look like that. But, you know, you have the plants on the top and you have this nice, thick, dark, nice smelling organic material, and then it transitions down to the more inorganic parts. And there's different forms of carbon. You know, you can see these little root channels coming down here, and the carbon is being stored down in the soil. Another question that I'm asked a lot and people think about is, how do you measure soil carbon? And the first thing to remember is that there's different forms. So like I mentioned, the apple versus the twig. And so there's different ways of measuring those different kinds of carbon. And this is just a snapshot. But what I want to show for farmers and ranchers is that it's not something that you have to do. You can send it to a lab, and then it's not magical. There's just different methods. So for example, soil organic matter, one of the methods among many is you literally put it in an oven and you combust it, and all of the carbon is driven off, and you weigh it before and after. So there's really hands-on ways to measure how much carbon is in soil or is in anything. You know, you can do an elemental analyzer, and that's slurping up the gases and measuring the proportions after you combust it. You can do really pretty color change reactions. That's the formal scientific term, is very pretty reactions to look at active carbon. And then another method is the eddy flux. So they're slurping up the gases and measuring the proportion of different kinds of gases. And because they're measuring wind speed and direction, they can tell, this very, very incredible computer can tell whether the air is coming down from the atmosphere or up from the ground. And so the balance of that can tell you if there's carbon coming in or out of the ecosystem. There's other methods. There's people who are working on developing like in-field sensors or monitors, as well as remote sensing. Those are things I'm not as familiar with, not my expertise, but they are happening, they are emerging, and there are companies that are basing carbon markets off of that more remote sensing rather than these lab methods. So that's just something to keep in mind, that there are lots of different ways, and different markets are going to be asking for slightly different things. but none of them are beyond comprehension. You can learn about the methods and they are doable. So Nick really, again, set me up really nicely. Where is the soil carbon in drylands? You know, if we click back 2 slides ago, you remember that nice dark brown layer. We simply don't have it here. There's a suite of characteristics that makes it hard to accumulate that layer at the top. And then we also have characteristics like this calcium carbonate accumulation that is an inorganic form of carbon, and it's happening over much longer timescales, even geologic timescales. So the carbon that's coming in and out is related very much to how much plant cover we have. But it's not accumulating in that nice thick organic layer that's visible to us. So there's a great study from about 10 years ago looking at the areas, you know, I'm in New Mexico, so I'm very New Mexico centric, using a model-based approach, looking for areas that were viable for carbon sequestration. And so, you know, you can kind of zoom in and look at the areas that you're interested in, but a pretty broad area. And we can go in and look at what their exact cutoff was for moderate or high, but it's a large area. And of course, what ranchers know is stewarded largely by agriculture, ranchers, farmers, and then of course, government and tribal landholders as well. So that's the capacity as of 10 years ago. Something that's critical, however, is with climate change, both the average and the variability are changing. I think we're all experiencing that right now, where last week in New Mexico, it was 104, and this week it's 70. So the fluctuations, not just the average, are increasing. And what that means is that drought is going to be more likely, as well as the flood events. And then with the change in the average, so here's the change in average temperature along this axis. This is different ecosystems in New Mexico. And every time we get hotter, we're reducing our potential carbon storage. So even though it's getting more and more important that we're storing carbon, because of what's happening in our broader context of the climate, it's getting more and more difficult with every degree that passes. So we're really up against a huge challenge, and there is potential. So we have to live with both of those things happening at the same time. So what's all that have to do with carbon markets? Luckily, Nick didn't, I found a couple more to add, Nick, to your list of things. So, and someone pointed out in the chat, we don't want to create perverse incentives where if you're doing everything right, we don't want you to go and plow up your field, drive off all the soil carbon, and then sequester it again, right? So we have to be really careful that, that we're creating proper incentives. This, because Quivira is really related to the food system, one thing we really want to see is that changes are benefiting the food system. And so in some cases, some of the biggest payoffs may be in riparian areas on a landscape. And then the uplands with the crops or the range are not going to be managed or change in management. And so we're disconnecting this climate solution from the food system. And Quivira really wants to see that held together and bound together, that we're all into this together. And so these solutions should work on both aspects. And then I think echoing what Nick said, because I'm in New Mexico and we're broadly in the Intermountain West, the costs of sequestration are going to be higher in drylands due to low water availability. So the changes that we need to make, so you know, if you need to pump a well or build a new well because drought meant that your water sources have dried up, that's a huge cost. Or, you know, if you want to start engaging in rotational or more rotational grazing, sorry, my brain just short-circuited. there's a large cost to fencing and building those fences, the time and the effort. So it's a very big cost. And so we want to make sure of is that these markets are going to be accessible to a broad swath, and that the winners and the losers in the new market system are equitable, and that we're not just releasing everyone, picking people who are going to win in the carbon markets and then picking people who will lose. One other consideration that and I'm not an expert on the policy or economic side, but something that I am always curious about is, if a drought hits at the end of your 10 years and you lose carbon, do you have to actually pay that $15,000? So those are a big question, a big red flag that I have. And then finally, coming back to the equity issues, how are we making sure that diverse producers are able to benefit from the benefits? Because as we know, the costs are disproportionately currently borne by the people that are the most underrepresented. So, so framing it a slightly different way, and maybe going into a more hopeful way, is, as Nick also said, there's a lot of things that relate to soil carbon that are added benefits. So productivity. So as I mentioned, the amount of ground cover is related to how much carbon is coming in. And that's also what the cattle eat. So management, moving towards increased ground cover, increased productivity. Of course, resilience to drought and erosion, soil stability and infiltration rate are going to be really key to building long-term resilience as the fluctuations increase. So when we have two frameworks that Quivira operates under, and I mentioned we have those research, outreach, and technical service provision, and both of these frameworks are how we approach all of that work. One is we really embrace the use of the healthy soil principles. So rather than a prescriptive management, you're turning the needle towards soil health by engaging with these healthy soil principles. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But this matches up with the NRCS, and so now there's the healthy soil health management plans that are available to help reach those goals. I also put this to remind myself to say, and monitoring over time is a really important thing. Both, again, if you're in a carbon market, you need to know what's happening over time, but we're really trying to support people to have decisions to be able to try things and monitor them, whether that's repeat photos, more formal surveys, but that it's empowering the producers rather than someone external to be assessing and seeing if you're meeting your priorities towards soil health. And our second framework, and I'm going to really highlight that our work here is in the research stage. So I'm not suggesting that this is going to work everywhere. We're really at the research stage, but we want to understand how to use waste productively. So for example, we've got a partner ranch that feeds out the pigs using food waste from the Roadrunner Food Bank here in town. And creates compost. And then we've been working on compost applications to restore, in this case, a part of rangeland that's been dewatered by this road. Likewise, there's possibilities of producing biochar from woody waste and then applying to increase productivity. So I think there's, again, if we look at a little bit more holistically rather than strictly through the narrow lens of carbon, there are pathways that people can start implementing, and that can be a way of getting started. So even if you're feeling out the carbon markets and you do know that you want to make a change, there's a couple of other reasons and there's a couple of strategies to help you move from thinking and learning about it to implementing it. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions and the rest of the panelists. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. An excellent presentation, and it generated quite. Next, we'll go to Zach, and Zach, I'll allow you to start your screen share.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right. So as Steve said, my name is Zach. It's great to be here with you all today. I work for a company called Keiko, and I will be talking about, generally speaking, what this carbon market landscape looks like now that we've heard a lot about what goes into a lot of these measurements and what the opportunities are. So I did just want to recap a little bit of what some folks have already said on the panel. With this illustration here, a lot of these details have already been mentioned, but I really wanted to remind all of us that we're working in an industry where there's a huge solution and opportunity in front of us. We're so lucky that as land managers and producers, the opportunity to really capitalize on this carbon offsetting scheme is in front of all of us, and something that we all get to take advantage of. There's so much going on in terms of the good work we're doing, in terms of how we manage our herds and manage our land, and all of the carbon markets and schemes that have been mentioned today are all opportunities that are in front of us to start capitalizing on. So with that, I did also want to frame this within the context of how a lot of folks in the industry are thinking about it these days. As we move away from our ranches and our yards and up to the packer processor and to the retailer, folks are most definitely looking at ranching as the real opportunity when it comes to carbon. They're also looking at it within them in terms of themselves and how the entire food supply chain works. And typically a lot of companies, the major retailers, major packer processors, look at themselves as producing emissions under what we call a scope 1. So their own processing facilities, their own fleet. They also look at the electricity they use as something called a scope 2. And then they look at all of us as ranchers and the emissions associated with our operations and the sequestration and avoided emissions associated with our operations as what we call scope 3. And that scope 3 is where we all and they all look for that opportunity. With that opportunity for sequestration and crediting and payments in mind, there are two systems at large that folks have previously mentioned on this panel. One is a compliance market, and that is something we're seeing here and there around the world globally, a tiny amount in California when it comes to their cap and trade market, but not extremely at large quite yet in the United States. Compliance market really focuses on regulations that at the state or federal level require lots of credit production and payments and taxes, and are very much tied to that policy level and that area of implementation. A really good example that we are hearing a lot about right now in animal protein, although it's not directly tied to ranching, is the California low carbon fuel standard market right now. There's a ton going on with carbon credits that are being awarded for dairy producers who are, for example, creating renewable fuel with biodigesters of their manure. On the other side of the equation is voluntary markets. And for all of us on the phone today, that is where the real opportunity and short-term opportunity currently lies when it comes to grazing and carbon ranching. There are a lot of voluntary markets popping up right now, whether it's through ag retailers, through consortia of businesses and nonprofits, or various technology schemes, but all of these are not compliance-based. There's an opportunity there for folks like us to voluntarily choose to participate in them, but there's no law requiring us to participate in them. The voluntary side of things is where those scopes that I just mentioned really comes into play, where a lot of folks at the higher end of the supply chain, such as a retailer or a packer processor, is really starting to think through, okay, I wonder if all of my suppliers might join a voluntary market, and then I can really showcase all the great work that they're doing on their land and compensate them. So it's no secret that when we think about this voluntary umbrella, as I mentioned, there's a lot going on there. And truthfully, it almost feels like to all of us that it is the Wild West in terms of carbon market opportunities. There's not a lot of compliance market going on, but there are many voluntary market schemes. These are just a few: Indigo, Nori, Ecosystem Service Markets Consortium, Bayer, Nutrien, and Farmers Business Network. All of these folks have come out with schemes of their own, markets of their own, partnerships of their own, where folks like us can enter into those markets and develop and verify and sell credits. But of course, each of these markets, each of these schemes is very different. There's a different price point associated with different credits, different contracts within each scheme, different requirements for data, for verification, and different requirements when it comes down to the individual contracts associated with each of these markets. So when I say Wild West, I really mean that there's a lot going on, a lot to pick from, and it's not always clear to all of us what the right answer is in terms of where we can channel effort for our own business. There are a few, however, that are really popping up to the main center stage, so to speak. And I think it was Nick that mentioned this one previously, but the Ecosystem Service Markets Consortium is making a lot of headway from a voluntary markets perspective in terms of aligning a lot of different members and entities of the food and agriculture supply chain, making sure they're developing robust scientific protocols, making sure that those protocols align with our beef producing operations as well as our commodity crop operations. So there's a lot going on with this group specifically. And as you can see in this slide, a lot of folks are joining up and tracking and following along with the development of these protocols. I believe it's about a year from now in 2022 when they're really going to launch this, but at the moment they have engaged in a very robust protocol review and development process, and it's really exciting to see what's going on. Outside of that compliance and voluntary markets scheme development that we sort of see popping up right now in the United States, I did also just want to draw all of our attention to something that we've been hearing a lot about in the news recently, probably only in the last few months or so. And that's something that folks have termed a USDA carbon bank. And the main thing I wanted to flag here is that this is not something that currently exists, but something like that Secretary Vilsack and others like him are playing around with as a concept to potentially scale out and create in the future, hopefully in the near future. There are a couple main points to consider when folks mention a carbon bank. One is that it's really, hopefully, not for sure, but hopefully going to add some clarity to verification of a lot of these markets and credits and those requirements. Secondarily, we're really hoping that for all of our benefit, that there will be some sort of a price floor that will be created for a lot of these carbon market schemes, where potentially that bank could purchase a lot of these credits and ensure that there's reliability in these new markets that are emerging. Very similarly, we're also hoping that it will include some sort of a price guarantee so that we know with a little bit more predictability what things will look like, and it won't be such a market to market, scheme to scheme differentiator when it comes to price. And then above all else, I think the main idea here is that folks are looking for some commonality, some way to unify a lot of what's going on, to create a set of ground rules that cover things across the board. But we do still have a bit of time to wait to see what this ultimately looks like. So I really just want to flag that I put this here as something to keep everyone's eye on and see what comes of it. It's likely that it will be a part of a farm bill at some point, potentially not, but it's something that's very much in the works right now. And a lot of people at USDA and elsewhere are working on it for our benefit. With that in mind, I did also want to just tie some ends from other things that other folks have said previously. As we think about agriculture and carbon ranching, there are a lot of opportunities in front of us when it comes to markets and protocols. A lot of these markets have various protocols that allow us to capitalize on a couple different credit opportunities. In cattle ranching, it really can focus on any afforestation that we might be contributing to, soil carbon, like folks previously mentioned, that we're creating in our soils if possible, nitrous oxide that might come from changing how we apply chem, energy conservation if we're lowering how we use energy on our operations, livestock waste management. So like I mentioned with dairy previously, although that may not be something that necessarily carves an opportunity out for itself in beef ranching. Methane, there's a lot going on right now with enteric and opportunities there and how that plays into a lot of this carbon equation. And then avoided conversion of land, such as keeping grassland in a specific ecosystem rather than converting it to cropland. So as we think about all of these different crediting opportunities, all of these different schemes, all of the unknowns in this wild, wild west, I did just want to throw up here a couple recommendations for what folks in the beef production space should definitely be paying attention to as you think about which market you might want to join, as you field questions from folks who are asking you if you'd like to join a market, if you're being approached to sign a contract, for example, about joining a specific market. The first one is, what is the business plan of the developer? Are they really focusing on helping you and your operation earn additional revenue? Or is it something that folds into a service that they're offering that you also have to subscribe to? What will you have to do to develop a credit? Is there a lot of upfront costs that are associated with that? Are there practices that you'll have to change? Are there things that you'll have to pull together, paperwork, data? It's really important to make sure we know exactly what that commitment is going to look like. Are you doing a new practice or a set of practices, or are you doing a practice that might not be common in your area? A lot of these contracts are really focused on additionality. So we want to make sure that not only are we eligible, but are we able to do the practice that's required? And truthfully, a couple others sit on this too, but is the practice that's being asked of me really applicable and beneficial to me in my geographic region and not going to harm things? How long will that practice be in place? Is this something that I need to do continuously? Is there an endpoint? Is this something that I need to be mindful of in case, for example, drought happens or accidentally carbon gets released from the ground? How much measurement and verification costs will there be and who will pay? So not only do I need to worry about the costs associated with changing and implementing practices, but am I going to need to find money somewhere to make sure I can pay for the services to gather the data and pay for the services to verify my outcomes so I can get my credits? And what will that look like when I balance it all out, the costs of verification and measurement and the income I might earn from those credits? Does it make financial sense for my operation? What happens if there is a reversal? So I mentioned this a little bit previously, but what happens if some uncontrolled weather system causes carbon to be released, or somebody comes on my land and accidentally releases carbon from the land without asking my permission? Or what happens if I forget, or a situation causes me to reverse some of the practices I was previously using? Is there punishment for that? Is there a monetary fee or fine associated with that reversal? What do I need to be mindful of, and how can I protect myself? What data are you providing? And is that data that you'd like to keep close at hand, or data that you're comfortable sharing? Is it data that you will continue to maintain ownership of, or does the contract say that you have to give all of it up? And what comes with that? How long is the commitment associated with giving that data up? And then, of course, there are the basic contract terms that a lot of us are being approached about right now. Every single one of these contracts looks different and may cover any of these questions, but it's extremely important to review those contracts or have a lawyer or a business advisor or someone that works closely with your business to review those contracts to make sure that they have all of these considerations in mind and that your operation is going to be set up for success rather than harm. So to close out my conversation, I really just wanted to highlight additional things that are happening out there in our legislative world that may help iron out some of these questions that I've raised that I really encourage you all to be thinking about in the near future. The first is the Growing Climate Solutions Act that I believe others have mentioned on the panel previously, but it really, really is focusing right now on setting some parameters around these carbon markets to add clarity and add a bit of a police officer to a lot of the questions that are really keeping us all up at night and ironing them out to make sure that this is in the best interest of producers. There is bipartisan support, and ideally, this will help us get to a place where we have a clean system of third-party verification so that we all know exactly what's expected of us, exactly the data to track, the resources to keep records for, and exactly what those costs might look like every time we have to get verification. The other big legislative update relates to a group called the Food and Ag Climate Alliance, also known as FACA. And they're really working hard. It's a consortium of groups, some environmental in nature, some much more producer related in nature, but they're focused really on making sure that it's the producer interest that is the main focus here, and making sure that these markets work for all of us. They're currently working on markets in terms of a wide variety of topics, but they're really trying to put together a lot of comprehensive recommendations to hopefully influence a lot of this federal climate policy in a way that works for all of us. That's all I had for you all today, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Zach. But we sure want to leave some time for Rich, and I'll let you. But I want to direct everybody's attention to the Q&A. There's been quite a conversation with the question and answers. You'll find how to get to the answers across the top and take a look at some of the responses by the panelists already. So, Rich, it's yours.
Rich, I think you might be on mute. Yep.
Sorry. All these presentations have just been amazing, and falls right in line with all the information that's out there, all the pitfalls, all the things that producers should be watching out, whether farmers or ranchers. And Nicole, I think that was one of the better put together presentations on the overview of the markets that I've ever seen. So thank you. Eva, yours was amazing. I know that you guys are working hand in hand with people down in New Mexico in that southern region. And Zach, that was amazing. I think Zach's presentation showed just how many people are interested in it. And Zach's presentation sort of hit some of my hot buttons as far as issues that I have with carbon markets. And so I was trying to jot this down and keep track of what everybody's saying, because there's just so many great points. I think that Eva said something that's really, really important. And she said that we have to look at this in a more holistic manner, and through not just through the narrow window of carbon, but through soil health, through a holistic thing. And last week I was at a couple weeks ago, I was at a carbon summit, and it had a really good approach. It was for us to be successful in capturing climate or carbon from the atmosphere, improving soil health, improving our rural communities. It's a really holistic look, and it's going to take making our communities healthier, getting good food back on the table, but solving climate change, solving the climate crisis is not just in this one little narrow thing. It's a very holistic approach. And I'm not trying to pick on Zach, but I think a lot of the verbiage that we hear in these carbon markets is directed at ranchers. And I hear it, people don't hear it, but as a rancher that's been involved in this, I do tend to hear that this is something that's happening to ranchers, not something that they have really been a part of. So I was trying to get back to my thing. I think that the important thing to remember here is on the ground where the most effective change is going to be happening. The people that are taking the greatest amount of risk and making the greatest amount of investment are going to be the farmers and the ranchers. And their say in the way that these markets should be constructed should be weighted as to the risk and the investment that they're putting into this this organization of trying to reverse climate change. And I don't think that's happening. I think that there is what people want to project upon ranchers and farmers, and then there's like what I call the dirt under the nails heuristic. And this is why I like to be on panels like this, so dirt under the, or soil under the nails. A lot of these conversations happen in a vacuum that do not have the people that are taking the risk, making the risk and taking the risk and making the investment. And every conversation needs to have a rancher and farmer in it about these markets and how they're going to work and who they're going to benefit. And one of the really good examples that I think is one of the things that really disturbs me about carbon markets is proprietary monitoring. I think for this to work, it has to be a universal system across the board that everybody can participate in, that can be regionalized and not centralized. It has to be a distributed type of system. And there's a lot of academics that are going to have to leave their egos in check and come up with real, clear, easy to implement, easy to monitor soil health practices and carbon gathering things for this to work. And it has to be able to be done by the rancher and farmer. I'm very leery of any carbon credit organization or business that comes in and says, well, you can't do this monitoring because it's proprietary and you'll have to pay this service every year. I think that's a huge barrier to implementation of this across the board. I think it needs to be something that either you can go out with your NRCS agent with, or you can do it personally on your own. The more third parties that we lump into this, the more we're creating the exact same system that got us into this situation in this part. This needs to be an intimate relationship between the consumer that's eating the food on the table, or the person that's creating the emissions that they want to offset, and the producer that's creating that change, that's having the positive having the positive practice that puts that carbon back in the ground. And the rest of the noise in the middle is where this whole conversation is going to run off the rails, because really what it matters is the people that are taking the risk and the people that are making the investment. And everybody in between, they are clouding what the issue is. And I think that there is this huge advantage for farmers and ranchers to recognize some value out of the ecological services that they are providing for society as a whole. And I think that the current system in a lot of these schemes, and I use schemes in a negative way, is, how would you say it? They're making ranchers and farmers once again price takers instead of price makers. And considering that everything in regenerative agriculture originates from the land, all economic wealth across our nation originates from the natural resources that we pull off our land. We need to get the rancher and the farmer as the price maker and not the price taker. And that's what's one of the biggest flaws in this whole marketing system.
Thank you, Rich. We're right up against our timeline, but I want to take a minute to panelists, Eva and Nicole and Zach and Rich. Great presentations, very informative. One information, and as Kobe told you in the chats, these will be made available to you. Kobe's going to put up the contact information. And thank you, AgriWebb, for putting this together. Such wonderful information for everybody today. Thank you, all the attendees, for taking the time and caring about this issue and wanting to learn more. Kobe, I'll hand it to you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And I'll quickly just share my screen. I think I've seen in the chat, a lot of people are interested in how to get in touch with us and with our panelists. So, leave it to, okay, here we go. So I'm just going to share this screen. We'll also send out some contact information, but Steve, Nick, Eva, Zach, and Rich, thank you very much for your time today. I think that it's an incredibly productive meeting. And why is AgriWebb sponsoring this event? Well, as of right now, we're a software ranch management platform, but I think especially when it comes to proving management, we're looking to work with producers across the country to have proof of management in case you've been a great steward of the land and great steward of the grasslands for generations. Moving forward, being able to have that in a data to support your activities when it comes to the carbon conversation, and also help move your business and manage your cattle and your operation as a whole. So if you're interested in AgriWebb, feel free to look us up online at agriwebb.com. Also, if you guys want, take a picture or a screenshot of this before we let you go. You have the contact information for all of our panelists, and of course, Steve, our moderator, with myself as well. But with the Q&As, I think that we've had a lot of great collaboration. I think that Nick and Eva and the panelists have done a great job answering as much as they can through the chat. So you might look at that. And then additionally, if you have any other questions, feel free to email them to myself. Or we also have these archives, so we will get background answers to your questions. We want to be conscious of your time and ensure that you can get on with your day and have a great 4th of July week and weekend. But if there's nothing else, I just want to thank everyone for jumping in today. I think very productive conversation, and we look forward to having more conversations about carbon, about different initiatives when it comes to the ranch, and really hoping to move this industry forward in the right way, as Rich mentioned. And with that, I think we'll say goodbye, and I hope everyone gets some rain over the coming weeks, especially in the Southwest. I know, and the West. I know you guys have been incredibly dry recently, but again, thank you very much, Nick, Rich, Eva, Zach, and Steve for joining us today. I know that you all are pretty busy with your schedules, but really, really appreciate jumping in and interacting with producers across the country.
This was fun. Thanks so much.
Yep, thank you, everybody. Learned a lot.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you all.